Elaine Parker adjusted her scarf as she stepped into the bustling terminal. The familiar rhythm of airport announcements and rolling suitcases blended into the background as she made her way to the first-class lounge. Today's flight wasn't just another routine trip. She was on her way to Geneva to deliver a keynote speech on the intersection of law and human rights. At 54, Elaine was a picture of elegance and confidence. Her tailored navy suit fit perfectly, a birthday gift from her younger sister, Naomi, who always insisted Elaine needed to dress the part. But beneath her polished exterior, Elaine carried the weight of decades of hard work and resilience. As one of the first Black women appointed to the Supreme Court, Elaine had fought her way through barriers that would have deterred most. She had faced prejudice in law school, condescension in courtrooms, and countless microaggressions in professional and personal settings. Yet, each challenge had only strengthened her resolve. Boarding was swift, and Elaine soon found herself in seat 3A. Near the window, she pulled out her tablet and opened the speech she had spent weeks perfecting. The theme was one close to her heart: justice beyond the bench, building equality in everyday life. Little did she know, the flight ahead would become an unwelcome case study in the very topic she planned to address. Elaine had barely settled in when Lydia, a flight attendant in her mid-30s with a practiced smile, approached her. "Good evening," Lydia said, her eyes scanning Elaine's attire. The warmth in her voice didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good evening," Elaine replied politely, returning to her tablet. Lydia lingered for a moment too long, her gaze flicking to Elaine's boarding pass, which rested on the tray table. "May I see your ticket again, ma'am?" "Just a routine check." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "Of course," she said, handing over the pass without hesitation. She'd flown first class numerous times and knew this wasn't standard protocol. Still, she maintained her composure. Lydia examined the ticket longer than necessary before handing it back. "Thank you," she said curtly before moving on. Elaine exhaled, forcing herself to refocus. She had learned long ago to pick her battles. This was likely nothing more than an anomaly, she told herself. By the time the dinner service began, the flight had reached cruising altitude. Elaine was engrossed in her reading, her mind already spinning with ideas for her speech. The cabin lights dimmed, and the soft hum of the engines created a cocoon of relative calm. When Lydia returned with the dinner cart, her behavior took another turn as she placed Elaine's tray on the table. Her movements were abrupt, causing the water glass to tip precariously. A stream of cold water splashed onto Elaine's lap. "Oh dear," Lydia said, her tone devoid of genuine concern. "These aisles are so narrow. Let me get you a napkin." Elaine bit back a retort, knowing that reacting would only escalate the situation. "Thank you," she said evenly, dabbing at her suit with the napkin Lydia eventually brought. Across the aisle, Margaret, an elderly woman with sharp blue eyes, observed the interaction with a frown. She leaned over and whispered, "That didn't seem very accidental." "Dear." Elaine gave her a tight smile. "I've seen worse," she murmured, returning to her work. As the flight progressed, Elaine did her best to focus on her work, but the nagging discomfort from Lydia's earlier behavior lingered. She took a sip of the fresh water Margaret had kindly offered and resumed her review of an upcoming case file. It was an environmental case, a dispute between a large corporation and a small community, a subject close to her heart. Yet, the words on her tablet seemed to blur as her mind replayed the subtle hostilities of the past hour. Lydia passed by Elaine's row several more times, each interaction more pointed than the last. Her eyes would linger on Elaine's tailored suit or the designer leather briefcase tucked under the seat in front of her. Once, Lydia leaned across Elaine unnecessarily to reach the passenger seated by the window, her arm brushing Elaine's shoulder with an unspoken message. "You're in my way." Elaine held her composure, her years in the courtroom giving her the discipline to remain outwardly calm even when her patience wore thin. Margaret, however, was less restrained. "Unbelievable," she muttered loudly enough for Lydia to hear as she leaned across the aisle to hand Elaine a tissue. "Some people have no manners." "Thank you," Elaine said softly, acknowledging Margaret's kindness with a grateful nod. As the cabin crew began serving dinner, Elaine prepared herself for another encounter. Sure enough, Lydia approached her seat with an expression that could only be described as forced politeness. "Your dinner choice." "Ma'am," she asked. Her tone clipped. "I'll have the salmon," Elaine replied evenly. Lydia returned a moment later with the tray, but as she placed it on Elaine's table, her movements were abrupt once more. The utensils rattled, and the small dish of sauce tipped, spilling a streak of creamy liquid onto Elaine's sleeve. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Lydia said, though the words lacked sincerity. "These trays are tricky sometimes." Elaine dabbed at the stain with the provided napkin, her jaw tightening. "It's fine," she said, though her tone betrayed her growing frustration. This time, Margaret wasn't the only one to notice. The businessman seated across the aisle, late 40s, with a pressed suit and silver-rimmed glasses, looked up from his laptop. His brow furrowed as he watched Lydia's retreating form. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" he asked Elaine, his voice polite but concerned. "Yes, thank you," Elaine replied, offering a small smile. She appreciated the gesture, but the last thing she wanted was to escalate the situation further. Public confrontations rarely led to meaningful change. She reminded herself. The dinner service concluded, and the cabin lights dimmed as the flight transitioned into its quiet evening phase. Most passengers were either dozing or absorbed in their movies, but Elaine couldn't shake the tension that clung to the air. Lydia reappeared, her expression now carrying a thin veneer of professionalism. She stopped beside Elaine's seat, leaning slightly closer than necessary. "Ma'am," she began, her voice low but firm. "I need to confirm something. Could I see your boarding pass again?" Elaine raised her eyes from her tablet, her brow furrowing. "I've already shown it to you. It's just routine," Lydia replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. Elaine felt a flicker of anger rise within her. She had flown first class countless times and knew this wasn't routine. Still, she reached into her briefcase, retrieving the boarding pass. She handed it over, her movements deliberate and calm. Lydia examined the ticket, her eyes narrowing as she read the details. "Government rate," she said aloud, her voice carrying an edge of skepticism. "And what exactly do you do for the government?" The implication was clear. Elaine felt the weight of the question settle in the cabin, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. She could see Margaret stiffen in her seat, her sharp eyes darting between Elaine and Lydia. Elaine took a slow breath, summoning the composure that had served her well through decades of courtroom battles. "I'm a federal judge," she replied evenly, "and if there's an issue with my boarding pass, I'd be happy to discuss it with the airline directly." Lydia blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "I see," she muttered, handing back the ticket with a forced smile. "No issue at all, ma'am." She retreated down the aisle, but the damage had been done. Elaine could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, their expressions a mix of curiosity, sympathy, and unease. Elaine tried to return to her work, but her focus had been shattered. The minutes dragged on, each one marked by the subtle movements of Lydia through the cabin. When the flight attendant passed by again, she deliberately bumped her cart against Elaine's armrest, causing the half-full glass of water on her tray to tip over. Water splashed onto Elaine's suit, soaking into the fabric and leaving a dark stain. This time, Lydia didn't even offer an apology. She simply moved on, as if nothing had happened. Margaret let out an audible gasp. "That's it," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. She unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned across the aisle. "You need to report her. Dear, this is completely unacceptable." Elaine dabbed at the water with a napkin, her hand steady despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Thank you, Margaret," she said quietly. "I'll handle it." The businessman across the aisle spoke up again, his tone firm. "If you'd like, I'll provide a statement. That was no accident." Elaine looked at him, surprised by his offer. "I appreciate that," she said sincerely. As the flight neared its final hour, Lydia reappeared, this time with a garbage bag to collect passengers' trash. When she reached Elaine's row, her body language was stiff, her movements mechanical. She avoided making eye contact, but Elaine could feel the tension radiating from her. Finally, Elaine decided it was time to address the situation directly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. Lydia paused, her hands tightening around the garbage bag. "Yes, ma'am." Elaine met her gaze, her expression composed but unyielding. "I think it's important for you to understand the impact of your actions today." Lydia's cheeks flushed, and she opened her mouth to respond. But Elaine continued before she could speak. "I've spent my career fighting for justice and equality, not just in courtrooms, but in everyday interactions like this. The way you've treated me on this flight isn't just unprofessional. It's a reflection of deeper biases that have no place here." The cabin grew silent. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen now turned their attention fully to the exchange. Margaret nodded in quiet approval, while the businessman set his laptop aside. His expression won a quiet support. Lydia's face paled. "You didn't mean?" Elaine held up a hand, stopping her. "I don't expect perfection, but I do expect respect. For me and for every passenger on this flight." The air in the cabin felt heavy, as though the plane itself was holding its breath. Elaine sat tall in her seat, meeting Lydia's stunned expression with unwavering calm. Years of courtroom experience had taught her the value of silence, of allowing words to hang in the air until they landed with full weight. Lydia fumbled with her trash bag, her earlier veneer of confidence cracking. "I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered, though the excuse sounded hollow even to her. Elaine tilted her head slightly, her tone gentle but firm. "That's often the case," she said. "Bias rarely announces itself outright. It's subtle, hidden behind policies and routines. But its impact is anything but subtle." Margaret, seated across the aisle, broke the silence. "And you've made your bias perfectly clear," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing at Lydia. "The way you've treated this woman is disgraceful." Several other passengers nodded in agreement, their earlier hesitance replaced with quiet solidarity. The businessman leaned forward in his seat, his voice calm but resolute. "She's right. This behavior isn't just inappropriate, it's unacceptable." Lydia's eyes darted between the passengers, her discomfort palpable. She began, but Elaine raised a hand to stop her. "Let's leave the excuses for now," Elaine said. "What matters is what happens next." Elaine stood slowly, her full height commanding attention. She smoothed her slightly damp suit, the motion deliberate, before turning to face the small crowd of passengers who were now fully engaged in the unfolding drama. "For those who may not know me," Elaine began, her voice steady and clear. "My name is Elaine Parker. I am a federal judge and a member of the Supreme Court." A ripple of surprise moved through the cabin. Murmurs broke out among the passengers, some leaning forward to get a better look at Elaine. The young woman seated 2 rows ahead, who had been quietly observing the interaction, pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, clearly documenting the moment. Lydia's face turned ashen. I didn't realize." "And that's the point, isn't it?" Elaine said, cutting her off. "You didn't realize who I was, and yet you felt entitled to treat me this way. What if I wasn't a judge? What if I were simply a teacher, a nurse, or anyone else traveling for work or leisure? Would my title, or lack thereof, justify the way you've treated me?" Lydia looked down, unable to meet Elaine's gaze. The tension in the cabin grew heavier, the weight of Elaine's words settling over everyone. Margaret reached across the aisle, patting Elaine's arm gently. "Well said," she murmured, her eyes glistening with pride. The businessman nodded. "You've handled this with far more grace than most people would." The young woman with the phone raised her hand slightly, her voice trembling but strong. "I just want to say thank you for standing up. It's not easy to do that, even when you're as accomplished as you are." Elaine offered her a small smile. "Thank you," she said, "but it shouldn't take a title or a public confrontation to demand basic respect. That's something everyone deserves." Lydia stepped forward hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Judge Parker, she began, her voice shaky. I'm so sorry for how I've acted. I didn't mean to cause harm. I was just... Just what? Elaine asked gently, her tone inviting honesty. I don't know, Lydia admitted, her eyes welling with tears. I think I made assumptions, and I was wrong. Elaine studied her for a moment, then nodded, acknowledging that is a start, she said. But real change comes from action, not just words. I hope this experience leads you to reflect on those assumptions and to challenge them in the future. As the plane began its descent, a senior flight attendant appeared, her demeanor professional but anxious. Judge Parker, she said, addressing Elaine directly, on behalf of the airline, I'd like to extend our deepest apologies for what's happened today. This is not how we expect our staff to behave. Elaine regarded her carefully. Thank you, she said, but apologies alone won't fix this. What I want to know is what steps your airline will take to ensure this doesn't happen to someone else. The senior attendant nodded earnestly. We'll be conducting a full review, including additional diversity and sensitivity training for our staff. And we'll be following up with you directly to ensure this matter is resolved to your satisfaction. Elaine nodded, satisfied for the moment. Good. I'll be expecting your follow-up. As the plane touched down, off deplaning began. Passengers gathered their belongings, but many paused to acknowledge Elaine as they passed her row. Some offered quiet words of support, while others simply nodded in respect. Margaret lingered for a moment, her hand resting lightly on Elaine's shoulder. You've inspired all of us today, she said softly. Thank you for standing your ground. The businessman handed Elaine his card. If you ever need a witness statement about what happened here, don't hesitate to contact me, he said. Elaine smiled. Thank you. Your support means more than you know. As Elaine exited the plane, she was met by the airline's regional manager, who offered another formal apology and promised swift action to address the incident. Lydia stood nearby, her expression a mix of shame and determination. Elaine addressed her one last time. Use this experience to grow, she said. It's not about punishment. It's about learning and changing. Lydia nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. I will, she said quietly. As Elaine walked through the terminal, her thoughts turned to the young woman who had thanked her, to Margaret's unwavering support, and to the businessman's offer of help. The experience had been draining, but it also reaffirmed Elaine's belief in the power of standing up for oneself and for others. She thought about the speech she would give in Geneva the next day. She had planned to talk about the importance of justice beyond the courtroom, about building equality in everyday life. Now, she had a personal story to share, a vivid example of how justice could be demanded and upheld, even at 30,000 feet. The following day, standing before an audience of legal professionals and human rights advocates, Elaine recounted the events of the flight. She spoke not with anger, but with conviction, using her experience to illustrate the need for systemic change and personal accountability. Justice, she concluded, isn't confined to courtrooms. It lives in our interactions, our assumptions, and our willingness to stand up for what's right, even in the smallest moments. It's up to all of us to carry that responsibility. The audience erupted into applause, their faces reflecting a mix of admiration and determination. Elaine stepped off the stage, her heart full of purpose. She knew the fight for equality was far from over, but moments like these reminded her why it was worth it. Months later, Elaine received an update from the airline. They had implemented new training programs and created a task force to address bias in their operations. Lydia had completed the training and written Elaine a heartfelt letter, thanking her for the lesson and promising to do better. Elaine folded the letter carefully, placing it in her desk drawer. It was a small victory, but one that reminded her of the power of persistence and the importance of never backing down. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about laws and rulings. It was about humanity and the courage to demand it, no matter where you were. As Elaine stepped out of the airport terminal into the cool evening air, she took a deep breath, letting the tension of the flight begin to dissolve. The past few hours had been an unexpected battle, one that had drained her but also reminded her of the very principles she had devoted her life to defending. The ride to her hotel was quiet. The driver, an older gentleman with kind eyes, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Rough flight?" he asked, sensing her weariness. Elaine smiled faintly. "You could say that," she replied, not elaborating. She wasn't quite ready to recount the details of what had happened. For now, she wanted to reflect and process the experience on her own terms. When she arrived at her room, she placed her briefcase on the desk and sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights. The speech she was scheduled to give the next day suddenly felt more important than ever. Justice wasn't just an abstract ideal or a lofty concept. It was something people live through every day. It was in the small moments, the quiet battles, the subtle and not so subtle indignities that demanded courage and composure to overcome. Elaine reached for her tablet and opened the document containing her speech. She began to type, adding a new section inspired by the flight. The following morning, Elaine stood at the podium, the crowd of legal professionals and human rights advocates before her. She took a deep breath, meeting their expectant gazes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady. "When we think of justice, we often think of courtrooms, of laws and rulings, of monumental cases that define eras. But justice is not confined to marble halls or legal texts. It is something we encounter, or fail to encounter, in our everyday lives." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "Yesterday, I was reminded of this truth in a way I hadn't anticipated. On a flight here, I experienced what so many people face daily: the sting of prejudice, the quiet dismissal of one's humanity based on assumptions and biases." The room fell silent, her words resonating deeply. Elaine recounted the events of the flight, not with anger, but with clarity and purpose. She spoke of the small indignities, the courage it took to stand firm, and the importance of using such moments as opportunities for growth and education. "Justice," she said, her voice rising with conviction, "is not just the domain of courts. It is alive in how we treat one another, in how we challenge assumptions, and in how we stand up not just for ourselves, but for those who cannot stand up for themselves. It is in the choices we make every day to see and respect the humanity in one another." The audience erupted into applause, some rising to their feet. Elaine felt a swell of emotion, but remained composed, bowing her head slightly in gratitude before stepping off the stage. Weeks later, Elaine received a letter from the airline. They had implemented mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff and created a new policy for handling complaints of discrimination. Enclosed was a handwritten note from Lydia, the flight attendant. The words were simple but heartfelt. "Dear Judge Parker, I want to thank you for holding me accountable in a way that made me reflect, not just on my actions, but on the kind of person I want to be. I've learned a great deal from this experience, and I hope to carry those lessons forward in every interaction I have. I'm deeply sorry for the hurt I caused, and I'm grateful for your grace in addressing it. Sincerely, Lydia." Elaine read the letter twice, folding it neatly and placing it in her desk drawer alongside the others she kept as reminders of battles fought and lessons learned. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Change never came all at once, but it was a start. Later that evening, Elaine sat with her niece, who was studying for her first semester of law school. The young woman looked up from her books, curiosity in her eyes. "And Elaine," she asked, "how do you stay so strong when people treat you unfairly?" Elaine smiled gently, reaching for her niece's hand. "Strength isn't about never feeling hurt," she said. "It's about deciding what to do with that hurt. You can let it weigh you down, or you can use it to stand taller, to fight harder, and to make sure the world becomes a little better for those who come after you." Her niece nodded thoughtfully, her expression one of quiet determination. Elaine saw in her the same spark that had carried her through decades of challenges and triumphs. As the evening wore on, Elaine looked out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere, a plane was flying through the clouds, carrying passengers with their own stories, their own struggles, and their own moments of quiet courage. And she knew, with unwavering certainty, that the work of justice, true, everyday justice, was never done. It was a journey, one she was honored to continue.